You're talking about a society that, for until quite recently, its marginal existence.
You couldn't get a cold or you'd die. You couldn't be in the water, you'd get an infection, you'd die. Like, everything killed you. The dog bites you, you die. You step on a nail, you die. That's the way it was. Like, you imagine racing a little kid, good chance he's gonna die.
Getting to age 5 would be, I think, is your benchmark.
Like, there wouldn't be that strong attachment. Like, there wouldn't be.
The immigration scheme started in 1869 with Maria Rye, and they officially ended in Ontario in 1939. The only reason they were bringing children to Canada was to put them out to work. The children were all the way from toddlers up until the age of 18. But you can't put a 2-year-old out to work. So what they would do with the younger children is they would foster them out until they became old enough to work. And then when they were old enough to work, say 5 or 6 years of age, they would then either charge the foster family a fee for having that child in their home, or they would remove the child from the foster care and then indenture them out to work. They were disposable. If they didn't work out, if the farmer didn't want to pay the money, if they got sick, they were sent back to the receiving home.
The execution of Mrs. Workman, an honest, industrious and pious wife and mother, took place in the jail yard here, behind public view on the morning of Thursday, 19th of June. The deceased, who lived in Moortown, never made what could properly be termed a confession, but never disguised or attempted to disguise the fact that she had beat her husband with a stick, which he had seized hold of for the purpose of beating her, which she wrenched out of his hands. After hanging about 20 minutes, she was buried in a grave prepared immediately under the scaffold, into which the body had previously descended to give it the necessary fall.
History doesn't vanish, dwell in monuments, or rest in bone and stone. It accumulates. Where and to whom we are born, advantaged or disadvantaged, loved or unloved, is the running sum of our ancestors. The values we share a legacy of choices made and choices denied to previous generations in times rife with injustice, hardship, and death. Ontario was, and arguably remains, the British colony of Upper Canada, cast in the image of Georgian England, then scarcely removed from feudal times, to rest on the backs of emigrants held obedient to their own survival, conditioned to know and understand their place in a hierarchy as old as the British Empire itself. The documentary you are about to see is a social history, an introduction of past to present in the name of the future, undertaken in the names of those still trapped under the weight of history, and inspired by the staff of Bernadette McCann House, a woman's shelter and support service at Pembroke, Ontario. Before multinational corporations ruled the world, empires were the business of European kings, who competed for raw resources and human labor around the globe by invading territories occupied by Indigenous peoples or First Nations. In 1792, British Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe, newly appointed head of the fledgling colony of Upper Canada, convened a parliament at Niagara-on-the-Lake to assert the rule of British law over a territory ranging from the Ottawa River to the Manitoba border. Simcoe's arrival in Upper Canada followed hard on the heels of troops of British soldiers and 20,000 Empire Loyalists seeking refuge from defeat in the American Revolution along the forested northern shores of Lake Ontario, the lower St. Lawrence, and the Niagara Peninsula. Simcoe's mission was to assert control over the refugee population and grow it, securing a Protestant colony, in his words, forever free of any spirit of democratic subversion, a plan he intended to execute by building district courthouses and installing magistrates selected from the wealthiest civilian refugees and military officers, ranks bought and paid for by the British aristocracy. Simcoe's plan failed, along with his reputation within 4 years. His legacy, a legal system founded on a medieval belief in the divine right of kings and kingmakers, has endured for over 2 centuries and counting, securing ancient, often antithetical values in Ontario stone. The underlying purpose of British law was to protect kings and an elite class of supporters, or mini-kings, from the masses. A patriarchy in Simcoe's era, composed of King George IV and some 200 landowners atop a population of 9 million souls on the islands of Great Britain and Ireland, the majority of whom subsisted as tenants, farming 20-foot strips of massive estates known as runrigs. Indeed, British so-called common law had little to do with the common man or justice, framing misogyny as an inevitable feature of the human condition, while reserving special contempt for children who were defined as chattels. An underlying principle of law still in evidence in Ontario courts, contributing layers of risk to the already high-stakes work of staff at agencies like Bernadette McCann House.
I do think, I mean, I'm being frank here, but I do think that they're considered property, and that's horrible. I think no human being is property.
Veteran domestic violence support worker and counsellor Lee Ann is the manager of Bernadette McCann House Women's Shelter.
There is family court, there is criminal court, and the two sort of don't cross paths. So you could have an abuser who's in criminal court, he has charges of assault, he could have 10 charges of assault, and that doesn't matter in family court.
University of Ottawa criminal law professor Elizabeth Sheehy.
There's not much by way of custody or access law that in any way can guarantee a woman that that child will not be forced to have visitation with that father, even if he's been violent to the mother, and sometimes even if he's been violent or abusive to the child.
You know, some things are beyond their control, and court is one of them. So it's hard to watch. And I know it's hard for the workers. I know it's really hard to see that, because their hands are tied, and the best they can do is, you know, sometimes you can go back and revisit the order.
Bernadette McCann House Executive Director Lee Sweeney.
You know, one of the interview questions we ask when we're hiring staff is, you know, Joey goes to his dad's place. His dad lives in the country. And dad is always asking about mom. What is mom doing? And the child has told you that they don't like that. So what do you help the child with? How do you help the child not answer those questions and not put the child at risk?
So we safety plan with the kids, and we chat about, you know, where is there a safe place that if something happened, do you know how to call 911? You know, is there a neighbor close by? Is there, can the access happen at an exchange center where it's safe to do so?
That's all part of safety planning, and we will bring the police in to do that training for us. And it's good for the kids to know that the police are good people. Sometimes they are not portrayed that way, and kids are afraid. They've been told many things. You can imagine if the parent's been told those things, what the kid's been told.
Why do women stay? Well, there's your number one reason. My children are going to have access alone with that person who's abusive to me. They don't have me to abuse. Who are they going to abuse emotionally?
That whole custody access, you know, supervised access process needs to be looked at. You know, it's so hard to share custody with someone you're afraid of, you don't want to be around. And I appreciate that supervised access provides, you know, someone to come, drop off their child, come back. But it's the texting, it's the communication, it's you know, and it's that kind of viciousness that people are subjected to because they still have to have contact.
Sharon, a child and youth support service worker at Bernadette McCann House, works with children and teens victimized by abusive adult relationships, explaining the dynamics of domestic violence and giving them tools to survive and ultimately reject behavior which all too often goes back generations.
We talk to the kids. We talk to the kids about the fact that it's not their fault. This is an adult situation. Adults we're all responsible for our own behavior, and the adults in your life are responsible for their behavior. It's not okay to hurt someone, even if you're angry. It's okay to be angry. Anger is one of the topics we talk about. Help them go through it and help them understand that there's tools to deal with your anger, because a lot of it is based on, well, they were angry or whatever. So we teach the kids that there's things you can do with your anger. That's not okay. That's not an okay way to display your anger, to hurt yourself or hurt others.
Social worker Rick Goodwin is a strong proponent of intervention and support for children exposed to domestic violence. He has worked with men suffering from the effects of violence and abuse for over 30 years, the last 20 as the co-founder of an agency dedicated to treating men consumed by anger, rage, and violence.
So if we look at what the conventional messages are to our boys and young men, well, you got to kind of tough it out in this life on your own. And there's lots of evidence to show that men, that's part of it. You don't ask for directions, you don't go to a counselor if you need help. You tough it out on your own, you're a lighthouse keeper. In the core of many men's experiences of rage and violence, that there is a fundamental issue of emotional dysregulation. That these men have not had particular learning of how to regulate their emotions, often because of problematic or abusive childhood that they experience, or witnessing family violence in the home. Conventional masculinity in the lives of boys and young men there are elements of that is relatively shaming. We can all experience shame. Victims of violence, victims of childhood abuse, of course, are much more prone to feeling shame. We refer to shame as the master emotion.
I worked in the classroom as an EA, and when I look back now, I can see that through what I've learned working here is that there may have been a lot of children who were misdiagnosed with attention deficit or mild learning disabilities that may have been suffering from the effects of witnessing domestic violence.
People don't understand that children see everything. You may think that your yelling at night is not being heard. Think again. Those kids hear that. They're scared. And they pick up on things that people just think, oh, they didn't see that. They didn't see Dad, slam his fist on the fridge. They didn't see the fact that Mom was crying, or that they could hear her crying and he wasn't around.
In contrast to children, British law was specific when it came to women, promoting domestic violence as a natural and healthy outlet for oppressed men, or those who reasoned themselves so, a diversion surely contrived by greater ruling class interests. University of Ottawa criminal law professor Elizabeth Sheehy.
At common law, husbands had the right to beat their wives with a stick that was no larger in diameter than their thumb. So this was called the rule of thumb. It was a common law principle that allowed men the authority to use violence against their wives. In Ontario in 1826, in a case called Hawley and Ham, the Ontario court adopted that rule and said that a man was entitled to engage in moderate chastisement and therefore use violence against their wives.
Sanctioned by law, generations of battered and abused women would find no refuge in the courts of Upper Canada, Canada West, or Ontario for over 2 centuries, giving shade to the ongoing notion that cruelty behind closed doors is a private family matter. And myths about domestic abuse based on victim blaming, mental illness, substance abuse, imported social values, or above all else, poverty, in a province with the highest rates of domestic murder per capita in all of Canada. Myths belied by provincial police statistics, showing 1 in 4 violent crime calls in 2018 were to private residences across the social spectrum, 1 in 3, the Canadian average, to homes with annual household incomes over $100,000, the majority involving female victims, 30% of whom held university degrees or college diplomas. Leanne blames much of that carnage on gaps in public education, a perspective born of 16 years of experience working with terrorized women of disparate backgrounds, most manipulated into blaming themselves for their own abuse.
I think that's a huge myth. I think all walks of life access services, from nurses to teachers to doctors, lawyers, and I think for those women who are in this, it can almost be a little more difficult because they carry this shame. I should know better, or I am employed, so what am I worried about? What are my concerns? Because at least I've got a job, and why did I wait this long? I think years ago, abuse was defined as physical violence. Abuse is way more than physical violence, as you know. We do see physical violence, but we also see a lot of emotional violence, financial abuse, control, a lot of intimidation tactics and threats.
Certainly talked about that you're not seeing as much of the physical, because people have clicked into that, right? So you're seeing more of the emotional, more of the mind games, more of the internet, more of that type. That's not, when I say emotional, it's you don't see it. And I think the old myth of, well, if she doesn't have a bruise or he's got a mark on him, that it doesn't really exist. I think we have done work in that area for sure.
Studiously ignored by politicians, Canadian laws addressing acts of terror, ranging from relentless bullying, threats, and emotional abuse to physical assault, broadly defined as domestic violence, have not advanced since 1982, when the late NDP MP Margaret Mitchell was jeered in the House of Commons when she rose to address domestic assault, then commonly referred to as wife-beating or battering.
1 in 10 husbands beat their wives regularly, and these women, I don't think this is a very much of a laughing matter, Madam Speaker.
Prompting a public backlash, which even then forced the House Speaker to issue an apology to Mitchell, followed grudgingly by the passage of a law making it a crime for the first time for a husband to rape or sexually assault a wife or partner, while leaving in place sentencing guidelines which to this day treat domestic or partner murder as a lesser offense than the killing of a stranger. Professor Sheehy explains.
So in British law and Canadian law, wife killing was seen as really a form of chance medley, which was really a form of manslaughter, accidental killing. That characterization of wife killing as essentially manslaughter, not murder, goes hand in hand with a man's right to use violence to control or discipline his wife.
In 1976, Library and Archives Canada compiled a comprehensive record of homicides committed between Confederation in 1867 and 1962, the year capital punishment or execution was officially abolished. The study captures names of both victims and killers, motives, means, and outcome or disposition of each case. It includes the names of 127 men hanged for the murder of a spouse, ex-spouse, girlfriend, or lover. Among 231 others, 110 of them in Ontario, whose automatic death sentences for the murders of spouses, ex-spouses, girlfriends, and would-be girlfriends or lovers were commuted to prison terms, including W.H. Harvey of Guelph, a sensitive fellow, according to this report, who, upon being charged with embezzlement in 1899, returned home to line up and shoot his wife and 2 school-aged daughters before fleeing. A momentary act of madness, the Toronto Globe reporter speculates, inspired by a misplaced desire to spare them future disgrace. And George Copen of Seton Street in Toronto, who responded to a petition for financial support of his 4-year-old son in 1919 by bludgeoning his estranged wife Fannie Mae Copen with an iron bar, dousing her with an accelerant and setting her alight. Spared the noose after his lawyer, a man with connections, successfully argued that her death might well have been an accident. An historical accounting which stands in sharp contrast to the fate of abused women who dared to defend themselves. The hanging of Elizabeth Workman at Sarnia in 1878, detailed in the opening of this documentary, had no public support. Every male of age in Sarnia Lambton had signed a petition for clemency presented to Conservative Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald by Liberal leader and arch-rival Alexander Mackenzie. Politics aside, Macdonald would find cover by consulting the judge in the case, and in doing so, ordered the execution to proceed. A contradiction explored in this legal text by Professor Sheehy.
Wife killing which was really a form of manslaughter, accidental killing. Husband killing has historically been viewed as the second most serious crime known to humankind. The first most serious crime is treason, killing or plotting to kill the king. Petty treason is killing or plotting to kill the little king, a woman's husband and master. And so petty treason as the second most serious crime in England historically carried a very severe and public form of execution.
Shaken by the near loss of Upper Canada to marauding Americans during the War of 1812, Britain moved to secure the colony, employing the military to engineer an inland supply route between Kingston and what is now Ottawa, and a military settlement at Perth to protect it.
So the surveyors came in 1815 and laid out a town 1 mile square. The next spring, you start getting the discharged soldiers and half-pay officers and their families, and by the end of that summer, you have several boatloads of civilian settlers from the Glasgow area in Scotland. So Perth was an instant town. By the end of the summer of 1816, there were a couple of thousand people living here.
Susan Code is a descendant of Irish emigrants who arrived at Perth in 1817. Allotted, along with the soldiers and other common folk, 100-acre lots of inhospitable rock-strewn scrub bush, held obedient by the imperatives of their own survival.
The culture shock would have been absolutely gut-wrenching, I guess is a way of saying it. And some people survived and some people did not. You would have left a place where, first of all, you probably never went further than the next parish, where everything is developed. Here, there's nothing. It's trees, it's rivers, it's rock.
Powered by the steam engine, the computer of the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution had spawned factories, mills, and mines, fueling urban slums populated by growing numbers of unemployed, and work at pitiable wages for women and children as young as 4, at constant risk of death by crushing, suffocation, or amputation. Conditions abetted by laws making poverty a crime, punishable by incarceration in workhouse prisons and death by starvation, disease, or exhaustion. Ottawa writer Valerie Knowles is the author of this definitive history of Canadian emigration.
You have rampant unemployment. Of course, when you have rampant unemployment, you have wages plummeting, and you have a lot of poverty as a consequence. You'd also had a lot of poverty in parts of Scotland, especially the Highlands, and of course Ireland. I mean, there was this lurking fear that there could be a sizable uprising on the part of the Irish. Well, they had the problem of overpopulation in certain areas and rampant poverty. And on this side, you had the need to secure an infant colony in Upper Canada. It became incumbent on the British government to try and promote the settlement of impoverished peoples.
Incumbent, expedient, and strategic.
But it was an incredibly risky proposition to get on a ship, and lots of them went down, and cross the Atlantic and come to the bush and start a new life. I don't think we appreciate the guts that it took to undertake that.
Mary Campbell's ancestor, a Scottish cooper or barrel maker, and his wife, preserved a rare detailed account of their journey in 1825 to the self-named township of Archibald MacNab, a bankrupt Scottish laird or lord. One of dozens of so-called private developers awarded 5,000-acre townships or estates to be overseen by an elite Protestant Toronto-based patriarchy soon to be infamously known as the Family Compact. Riven by profit and greed, the scheme would inevitably lead to widespread injustices, countless tragedies, and unspeakable hardship, giving rise to coping strategies still haunting Ontario families and social values specific, if not exclusive, to the province, or what British Lord Durham would conclude was the most corrupt colony in North America.
It was a relatively new ship, and its cargo was coal. So it would have been a lot of coal dust. You got allocated, your family got, and I think there were 134 maybe people, 80 families, and you got allocated your bunk. So 2 parents and the 2 children had one bunk against the hull of the ship. And it was all chamber pots, and yes, there'd be a communal fire where you could cook something if you had something.
Cramped in holds rife with human fluids and disease for weeks to months, tens of thousands of migrants, including the Campbell's infant daughter, would die at sea, leaving newly orphaned children, widows, and widowers to disembark, frequently amongst the ailing at Grosse Ile, a barren island south of Quebec City, fitted with sheds posing as hospitals and rocky graveyard, leading many, particularly during Ireland's potato famine in the mid-1840s, the failure of a lone crop amidst a harvest of plenty, to refer to emigrant vessels as coffin ships. While those who arrived alive, their passage sponsored by a toxic mix of government grants and private developers, often found themselves stranded at Quebec City, 300 or more miles from Upper Canada. Duncan Campbell is Mary Campbell's first cousin.
It was gruesome. It was, there was nothing. They came up the creeks. They came from Montreal, and then they came to Arnprior. Then you had to work your way up to your claim, your allotted land. And then you got up and you made a camp. They all cut into the banks of the creeks, and then they made a wooden roof, and they dug into the soil, and then that was where you had to spend your first winter. But a lot of them had, they never saw this kind of cold, from Scotland, serious frostbite. So there were stories of my grandfather or my uncles, they'd have to cut their fingers off, frostbite, right? So you'd have to cut your own, amputate.
So the deal was, when you came, you got a location ticket for your lot. Front half of, we're sitting here at the front half of lot 12 on concession 12. And you had to do so many improvements. So you had to clear 3 acres, and build a 12 by 18 foot cabin within 3 years, but they got extensions to that. The important thing was you had to do that, and then you could apply to purchase your land.
Marooned in a landscape carpeted in primeval forest, emigrants set about felling trees, seeding potatoes and turnips between stumps. Over 275,000 refugees would follow the Campbells to Upper Canada between 1829 and 1851. More than half Irish, predominantly Catholics, banned from owning land in Ireland by King Henry VIII for generations. Typically, poor women in many parts of Britain held off marriage and the real prospect of death by childbirth until their late 20s in exchange for affection, if not love, leading to narrower windows of fertility, which combined with the frequent deaths of children had led to smaller families in many corners of Great Britain, an unsustainable approach to life in Upper Canada.
Children, I mean, you needed them. You needed them. There wasn't the luxury of, they had to haul water. You needed somebody to haul. We didn't have running water. So somebody had to bring the water. Somebody had to look after the smaller children. There's no birth control or very unreliable birth control. So it comes down to necessity. Just cooking alone is a full-time job. Laundry takes a whole day. Water, drawing water, like all of these things, it takes a community to do it.
Often malnourished, worn down by work indoors and out, many women felt driven to risk annual pregnancies in an era continuing past World War I in Ontario, where 3 out of 4 babies died before the age of 1, and children were lost to every malady imaginable.
Dad had a story, I've forgotten the name of the family, but while the husband was away, the kids got cholera. And I have an occasion in my own family of cholera. But it was rife during the 19th century. And all the kids died, one by one. And she kept the bodies in the creamery, frozen in the creamery, because she couldn't dig the graves, and waited for her husband to come home. So he came home to find his whole family, other than his wife, gone. Well, yes, I think Dad said that there were 6 kids.
Forced to rely on children to survive, denied time or space to mourn or grieve their loss by endless physical toil, many families found themselves, in the exquisite words of late Irish novelist Maeve Binchy, too poor to afford affection. While children who did survive were soon forced, by lack of resources, to strike out on their own.
You were either a housekeeper or you got married.
Women laid low by exhaustion and unspent grief were offered miracle cures, exhorted to dig deeper, do more, while others, desperate for relief, opted for more discreet treatments.
Like a good instrument, like it was a big box, like a wooden box, and there was electrodes, and I think it looked like as long as I think you put your fingers on, and then you cranked her, and then I think they used a lot of shock therapy back then for depression. Like there would have been a lot of depression, like for women. Oh yeah.
British contempt for children, and poor children in particular, knew no bounds. Callous values imported by Ontario's Family Compact ascended to federal dominance at Confederation and joined with the British government in 1868 to relieve emigrant families by importing indentured children as young as 4. In a for-profit scheme that would see over 110,000 British children, including 10,000 destined for Ontario, imported as child slaves between 1868 and 1938. A joint scheme initially conceived to relieve Britain of impoverished children and provide low-cost labor to childless settlers and households who preferred to send their own children to school. Initially supported, but soon opposed by men like psychiatrist Charles Clark, founder of the Clark Institute in Toronto, who did not object to importing child labor per se, but soon insisted on what he referred to as a better class of child, arguing that the importation of impoverished children bearing, quote, the stigmata of physical and mental degeneracy would end in the pollution of Ontario's gene pool.
And that was a common thought throughout Canada. So it started way back in the beginning. It never stopped. Up until the very end of these programs, these children were still labeled that way.
Laurie Ovchesky is the head of British Home Children Research and Advocacy, a resource centre for Canadian descendants of those children, searching for answers to family mysteries dating back generations, and in the process, she hopes, restoring dignity and meaning to the lives of their ancestors.
In 1897 in Ontario here, there was a law that was put into place, and that law was to protect us against these children. And they were restricting the types of child that could be brought into this country.
Initially founded as an alternative to workhouses in the 1860s by compassionate individuals like Dr. Thomas Bernardo and William Quarrier, British Children's Homes had grown to offer shelter and sustenance to children whose parents had nowhere else to turn in times of trouble.
In England, they built institutions that were used to house the poor. And the workhouse conditions, they were made to be worse than the worst living condition possible. So where these institutions that were immigrating children to Canada, where they got their little edge on the whole thing, is they built institutions that housed children that were far better than the workhouse system. And they all boasted like an ever open door policy. They didn't want to turn away any child in need. But in order to keep that policy up, their organizations got so overcrowded with children that they had to create a backdoor. They had to alleviate that overburdening of children in their institution. That backdoor led to Canada. Now, when we go back to the organizations such as Bernardo's and Quarriers and Fagan House and Middlemore, it was written in their contracts that they had the right to immigrate these children. That was the parents' consent. I'd have to say that the average parent wouldn't understand the child care laws, and I don't think that half the parents that were turning their children over were literate. They couldn't read.
Children transported to nearly 50 so-called receiving homes between Ottawa and Hamilton to be distributed by age and gender and without regard to siblings, to any adult willing to sign a contract agreeing to keep them, under unspecified conditions, until or if they reached 18.
In Park Lawn Cemetery in Toronto, we discovered the bodies of 75 children. And in 2016, we put a monument up. There are 2 mass graves of children. There are graves that were meant for 25 bodies. There's 75 children crammed in there. 75 children that were discarded, abandoned, buried, forgotten. We have suicides. We have medical deaths. And we have babies. And we have unwed mothers. Sexual abuse of these children, the girls, was rampant. It was a huge problem. So big that Dr. Bernardo had to open maternity homes in Toronto. My Aunt Mary, who came to Peterborough, was moved 20 times in 8 years. One farmer left her on the side of the road. She gave birth to a stillborn baby on the farm. Yeah, the terms of the indenture would really depend upon the age of the child. If you have a child coming over at the age of 7, they're going to be indentured until they're 18.
Leaving adult survivors alone, many mute with shame, seeking some degree of normalcy by establishing families of their own.
I think that what we have to remember with the home children is the vast majority of these children went on and made good lives for themselves in Canada. The vast majority married and had children. It's now estimated that we have about 4 million descendants of home children in Canada. We talk to the survivors, and we talk to their first and second generation descendants. Those are the things that is the most common, is the difficulties that they had in raising their own families. When you're told that you're a nobody, that you're garbage, and you're treated that way, it's a cycle of abuse. And you see the cycle of abuse in today's women. When you're abused, and when you're beaten, and when you're told that you're garbage, and when you're told that you're no good, when you're told to get out, nobody wants you here. you begin to believe that the problem is you, and that you've done wrong, and that you deserve this, and that you need to try harder. And if you try harder, things are going to get better. And it just doesn't, because you're not the fault.
I think children live what they learn. And I think if they're taught, I don't want to say it's across the board, because not all children who live with abuse become abusive or become victims in an abusive situation. But it is an intergenerational cycle, and we've seen it here. We've had mums here, 20 years ago, and we've had their child here as a victim and also as an abuser. So we've seen it. So it is intergenerational for sure. But I don't think that's their path, that they have to, because you grew up in an abusive home, you're going to be an abuser.
Well, there's no question that our failure as a society to intervene and protect children costs us all in the long run. Those children's lives are treated as expendable and infinitely reparable, which they're not. So there's no question that there's a serious issue there in terms of whether and how we intervene to protect kids, and whether and when we believe children, when they tell us what's happening.
Lise Sweeney is acutely aware of the historic origins of domestic violence. Supported by a progressive board of directors, she has worked with staff for over a decade to develop and implement programs for not only women and children, but men, often in coordination with other agencies. In 2018, staff, answering Bernadette McCann House Women's Shelter and Support Services Crisis Line, responded to 1,117 calls, including 39 from men. Provided support to 316 women and 183 children through outreach programs. Worked with 19 men to improve their parenting skills through a program jointly sponsored by Renfrew County Family and Children's Services. Admitted 74 women and 66 children to their residential shelter. 70% of mental health problems begin during childhood or adolescence. 17% of Ontario children aged 2 to 5 now meet the diagnostic criteria for mental health problems. 62% of Ontario youth report ongoing problems with stress, anxiety, or depression. 5 out of 6 will not get the treatment or support they need.